Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's so great to be with you all today. I'm joined here today by my colleague, Charlie Glassenberg, and Judy Kaye, who chairs our Committee on Development and is a member of our Board of Directors. For those who are not familiar, CJP, Combined Jewish Philanthropies, is the Jewish Federation of Greater Boston. So we have a different name, and sometimes that can be confusing to folks. First, I just want to thank Alana and everybody at SRE for an incredible day. My mind is still filled with the last three sessions that I went to, so I'm going to focus now on the work in front of us. And I want to thank you, Alana, and everyone for your field leadership. I think the conversations we've been having today are just so groundbreaking and really such an important and motivating place to be with all of you. So I want to share a few kind of framing reflections, and then I'm going to ask some questions for Judy and Charlie to reflect on our process and kind of how we got here. I want to start and just say that we're at the beginning of this journey. We did not come here with something that we have, had in practice for a decade, and we feel like we're the field experts. We are really just at the beginning of our learning journey, and we're continuing that journey today with all of you. We hope to learn from you today and into the future. And that, we hope that what we're offering today is a case, an example of how we have applied the values and the community that we are part of to this issue, and that it might be very different for your organization and your community, but we're happy to be in that conversation. The second thing is that we feel very blessed that we entered into this process in a non-reactive way. There was no active live case happening in Boston where we felt we needed to move quickly in a way that would force us to make decisions that we had not had time to be thoughtful about. And we recognize that that's a privilege, that we're able to take our time and be in thoughtful, collaborative conversation across the community. And the last thing I want to say is that creating a policy around potential donor misconduct that could put your organization in any area of risk, whether reputational or financial, is hard. It's really hard. And every day I pray that this policy is the umbrella you carry on a sunny day, that we'll never ever need to use it, and that umbrella will stay closed. And at the same time, I think what you'll hear from Judy and Charlie and I today is that we're really proud of the work that we've done. I think that the hard conversations we've had with each other, with our board, with our development committee, with donors, has built up a trust bank, and it's kind of opens a pathway to have conversations around hard topics where I'm not sure that everybody felt that those topics were on the table before. So for nothing else, we've created an environment where we can talk together in a respectful way about some hard topics. Okay, so with that, I want to turn it over to a few questions for Charlie and for Judy. Judy, I'll start with you. When you think about this policy that we've created, can you give us like a brief outline of what it is and what it isn't?
Sure. So CJP's policy to address risks to the organization posed by donor conduct addresses how we as an organization will handle the acceptance of gifts by donors whose conduct puts us, our people, or our reputation, or even our ability to fulfill our mission at risk. This is a 911 policy, and we've talked about this. It's to be used, as Jennifer said, in extreme cases. We hope we never have to. It does handle a number of other related issues that were really unfortunately raised by the Jeffrey Epstein matter, including the acceptance of anonymous gifts. So we at CJP have a code of conduct for our volunteers that addresses harassment and offensive behavior by volunteers. And this policy actually extends that same sort of set of parameters to donors as well. This is not an HR policy on sexual assault and whistleblowers and stuff that you would ordinarily see in HR policies today. Our HR department handles all of that. This is also, and this is kind of an important point that sort of came up somewhat unexpectedly, it is not a filter through which we will sort donors based on their political views. We have a big tent culture. We're a community organization. Our values are big tent. And this policy is not intended to change that. It really gets at those really hard, difficult situations you never have to want to deal with, but gives us a framework for doing so.
Thanks, Judy. And Charlie, can you tell everybody a little bit about kind of what was the impetus for starting this process, and like how did we actually get started?
Sure. So we began thinking about this as we saw how some other organizations responded to challenges they were facing around donor conduct, especially some of our Boston area universities. We are in Boston, it is a college town, and how they responded to the issues that came up around the Jeffrey Epstein matter, which Judy talked to, and also their engagement over many years with the Sackler family. several of the universities published retrospective studies that looked back on how they had handled those interactions with those donors, and it proposed valuable lessons and guidelines for them um, around processes and structures for those universities to have in place in the future. And that then informed us as a mission-driven public charity um, on how we would address these really hard decisions. From the beginning, one thing we understood was that our volunteer leaders needed to have a role in the toughest decisions. Our volunteer leaders, Judy and her peers, are our fiduciaries, they are the ambassadors, and ultimately they're the custodians of this, at CJP, 126-year-old Massachusetts public charity. So we had a model for that in an existing ad hoc committee that I've had the privilege to staff over a number of years that makes the final decision when CJP is offered an asset, something like real estate, art, private stock. One time we were given a blueberry patch, where we have to think about how ultimately we will turn that into cash in support of our charitable mission. This group includes both professionals and volunteers. It meets only as needed. Its work is confidential, and it has the power to make the final decision for the organization. So from that, we developed what ended up being called the Philanthropic Risk Management Group, composed of board leaders and members of our executive team, which can act together, again, to address the toughest situations.
Great. And Charlie, do you want to say a little bit about the outline of our process, where do we go from there? Actually, Judy, maybe you're going to take this first, where we went from there, and how we really started, and what were some of the tough topics that came up?
Go ahead, Charlie.
Okay, so we started working on this back in 2019 when we started adding language to new gift agreements around removing or changing the names of funds, of physical spaces, or of programs. The first donors who started to see this new language were generally supportive, understood where we were coming from, and gave us really valuable feedback to strengthen our commitment to involving, again, volunteer leaders in these significant decisions. The first set of draft guidelines that we prepared, we shared with our Committee on Development in February of 2020. And then, well, everyone knows what happened right after that. We had to shelve this, put it on the back burner while we addressed the pandemic. As part of my role in governing enterprise risk management, I flagged this as something that was a priority and should be a priority for the institution coming into our 2021 fiscal year, so back last summer. And we started to refine that document, think it through, and think about what the process would look like. We iterated that through in a series of conversations, first with a group of our board officers and standing committee chairs, with our professional executive team, with our Committee on Development, and ultimately with virtually our entire board of directors, either as a group or in one-on-one conversations. We also, in the very final stages, tapped our longtime outside legal counsel for some last-minute tweaks and language adjustments. Though I do want to emphasize that this was not intended as a legal document. It wasn't drafted kind of counsel first. They came in at a later stage to help us really kind of fine-tune and tighten it up.
Thanks, Charlie. And, Judy, you and I were in many, many of the conversations with our board, with our development committee, and with many of our kind of multi-generational, long-standing donors as we went through this process. It was not all smooth sailing. There were some bumps in the road. And can you share a little bit about kind of where things did go smoothly and the surprising places where we got some pushback and how we handled that?
Sure. It was full of surprises, but everybody was in alignment that we needed a policy that balanced, on the one hand, providing guardrails for the organization, with, on the other hand, creating space to exercise discretion in these really troubling and sensitive and often really embarrassing situations. We also needed the right people in the right seats exercising that discretionary power. And Charlie talked about the Philanthropic Risk Management Group that is comprised of our top professional and volunteer leaders. The other thing that people were really clear on, in agreement on, they wanted to know how the process would work. They wanted to know, what is this discretionary group going to do? How are they going to do it? How are they going to be activated? And most important, how would accountability and transparency be addressed? So we ran into some pushback when some donors we checked in with, just to sort of test drive this with them, observed that on its face, the policy could be later applied from the politically neutral place where it begins, dealing with criminal or criminal adjacent conduct, to situations where professional and volunteer leadership might in the future choose to reject or unname a gift because they disagree with donors' politics. And that took us kind of aback, and we thought, no, this is the last thing we wanted here. We are a community organization. We represent the entire community. And so in order to sort of head that off, we dealt with it with some helpful clarifying language in the preamble, with the way we framed it to our board, and with the record that we created, even going to the sort of the extent of making sure that the minutes captured certain points that we wanted them to capture, so that there would be almost like sort of a legislative history around this that would make clear what we were trying to do. It was full of surprises, but we had, at the end of the day, a really short meeting to approve it because it had been vetted so many times, at least at the Committee on Development level, so many times by so many people that people were really on board by the time we got to the end.
Great. And I'll just add to that I think, one of what I said at the beginning is like one of the major benefits here was just the opportunity to have these conversations with donors when it wasn't about anything that had happened or about them. And it taught us a lot about how people think about their own philanthropy and their own connection to CJP that almost had nothing to do with this topic, but that in and of itself was an incredible part of the process. And, Judy and Charlie and I, there were definitely moments where one of the three of us wanted to kind of turn and run for the hills. And so I'll say also as a point of suggestion that you have to have a team of people who will kind of hold you moving forward, even when you have a tough conversation with somebody who really pushes back. And that was also a really important learning, I would say, from our process. So when you think away about like the kind of like greatest takeaway of the last, I don't know, Charlie, you said we started in 2019. So whatever that is, coming up on 18 months, let's say, of this process, what are some of the biggest takeaways that you both see? I don't know who wants to start. Judy, if you want to start.
Sure. Well, first of all, you really have to know your community really, really well. I think one of the reasons we've achieved consensus on this really difficult topic is that we knew how to talk to people in our community, how to sort of listen to them, and how to talk to people with a lot of different perspectives on this in a respectful way. And I think that really made for a better product. Many voices, many ears, it made it better. So, I think the fact that we all live sort of in close relation with one another, even though we are technically a large state federation, was really helpful. I think the other big takeaway for me is that it's incredibly important to strike the right balance for your organization. I feel we did it for us, between structure and flexibility. Structure is the guardrails that really sort of guide you in this work, and what are your red lines, and the flexibility to address these really sensitive and troubling situations. And that's where our sort of little philanthropic risk management group comes in. That brings the flexibility to address the uniqueness of every situation.
Thanks, Judy. And Charlie, so I want to hear from you also, places where you thought it was smooth and where you thought it was prickly, and any kind of like your greatest takeaways from this work.
Sure. So picking up on what Judy was just talking about around guidelines versus flexibility. For me, a real key learning was making this a real formal policy. My instinct, as I like to on these sorts of things, was to have a policy that was a set of guidelines, what I would describe as kind of a set of guiding values, and a few key things we would address. And Judy really pushed us to think about this as a governance document that spelled out very clearly the role, the different areas we would address, but particularly with the philanthropic risk management group, who would be on that group, how its meetings would be conducted, how within that group we would address a conflict of interest if a party on that had a connection or perhaps, God forbid, were even involved in one of these problems, how we would substitute people in and out. And so it created a policy that feels serious, feels firm, but at the same time is adaptable, thoughtful, and lets the organization move through time while still relying on something that's really solid. The other thing, and I've said this a couple times, and I really emphasize it, is engaging volunteer leaders from the beginning and throughout. in making the case institutionally and with their peers for the policy, in bringing their thoughtful language and drafting it and refining it, so that ultimately there is a co-ownership of the policy between the institution's management and its volunteer leaders, who, again, as I said earlier, really are the representatives of a 126-year chain of volunteers who donated their time and their genius to this organization.
Mm-hmm. I'll just add to that. I think one of my greatest takeaways has been the sort of support and trust I think this has helped our staff have in our lay leadership and our board, and honestly, many of our largest donors. So much of what you read about philanthropy, and certainly, Jewish philanthropy is not excluded, is that there's sort of these large donors behaving badly, kind of set out to really kind of ruin things in the nonprofit landscape, and certainly across the Jewish community. And of course, that is true. And I think, like anything, when you don't actually talk about what you value and what you care about out loud, those narratives take on like a much bigger presence than they might actually have in the day-to-day lived life of your organization. And so Charlie and I hosted a staff session last week with the full development staff at our federation, and 20 or 30 people came, and we just talked to them about like how this went, and some of the conversations we had with donors, and what was hard and what made us feel great, and again, hoping that we never have to use it. I think that just making sure that there's a space in your organization where people can talk about this, can say like, if this happened or if that happened, how would we think about it? We do feel now a greater sense of confidence that we have a plan and a process for how we would think and talk about it. And I think that's giving our staff a good feeling that we're in this together, and that we are all working towards the same goals. So we have some wonderful organizations on this call today. And if anybody has questions, you could just, I don't know how that worked before with Alana and Kali, but just put them in the chat, and I think I'll figure out how to see them so I could ask Judy and Charlie the questions. But when you think about the hundreds of organizations who are joining us today, who I imagine range in all different kinds of sizes and shapes, what kind of advice would you have for others who want to enter into a similar process? I think we can take both from what Charlie and I have said, that the first thing is making sure you have a Judy Kaye on your team. Like, whoever the Judy Kaye is in your organization, you really can't move past the starting gate without the right volunteer leader and partner who believes that this matters and will really have your back with the donors and the board and the development committee. But after that first step, what are some of the other things that you would advise other organizations to think about as they start this process?
So I'm blessed with an incredible professional team. I mean, it's like an incredible privilege to work with thoughtful partners who are not afraid to really dive into really hard topics like this one. I think the two pieces of advice I have for organizations, large or small, are iterate, iterate, and iterate. That's one piece of advice. And the other is, don't be afraid of people who might not agree with you. If anything, I think our process really benefited from sharing drafts over and over again with thoughtful people with very specific points of view on this. And many of them held, viewpoints we didn't really agree with, but we had to hear and figure out how to address. And I think as a result, our process was better, more inclusive, and our product was better as well.
Charlie?
So totally agree with Judy's points there. I would just note two things. First of all, is to take an opportunity to benefit from the other boards and the other volunteer involvements that your leadership has. We benefited in our situation from having some board members who sit on committees on development, who sit in senior governance roles at major colleges and universities in New England and outside, as well as, and this was germane particularly to some of our conversations about naming, a number of folks who've been in leadership roles in the independent school and the prep school community, which in New England has addressed some really challenging situations around how people are honored, and then in subsequent perspective, they are not people necessarily who represent the best values of those institutions. The other thing I would say is to act now, to not wait, to, as we pointed out at the beginning, to take advantage of a time of relative comfort and privilege to put these guardrails in place so that the phone is ready to call 911, as my colleague has said. We don't ever want to do this, but we're also realistic about human folly, about flaw, about the world we live in. So one of our next steps on this is we're actually going to pull our philanthropic risk management group together, and we're going to test drive this. We're going to create some scenarios based on what's happened at other institutions and do a tabletop exercise, as they say, where we think and look and say, here is a scenario that could happen. Let's talk through in real time how, as a group, we would think this through, address it, and look to pressure test and make sure that our process would work, and to have the hope that that's the only time we ever have to do it.
Great. And I think, Charlie, you bring up a really good point that we didn't mention previously that I just want to clarify, is that we made a decision early on that this policy would not be like a rule book. If you do this, then this punishment happens, or then this, consequence happens. We didn't predetermine the decisions we would make on a variety of potential areas of misconduct. I think primarily because we didn't want to tie our hands. This policy was written at a particular moment in time when we're dealing with particular facts on the ground. And as everybody knows, that could change, could be different tomorrow. So we really wanted to make sure that this policy was about a process and drew some of the kind of guardrails around the things we will and will not, allow. And so I wonder, Charlie, if you can just say a little bit about the piece around anonymous gifts, because I think that was a big, it seemed at the time like that was a kind of a big aha for our conversations. And it is one of the kind of specific places in the policy where we call out something we will not accept. In other places, we're leaving it up to the group to make decisions.
Sure. So this was a place where, again, looking at what some other institutions had encountered, and again, with specific reference to the Jeffrey Epstein situation, where universities accepted gifts knowing that they did not know who the real donor is. And so what we said as a policy was that for gifts of $1,000 or more, which is a threshold at which CJP publicly recognizes donors, we will not accept a donation if we do not know who the legal donor of the fund is, or if it comes from a donor-advised fund program or a trust or a foundation, that we do not know who the party is who recommended or triggered the gift. Now, I want to be really clear, we were clear in the policy, we will continue to honor and respect to the utmost donors who want their giving to be private, meaning they would not be listed in a donor report or publicly acknowledged as the gift. But from our point of view, and I'm going to use a term from the banking and finance world, we're going to KYC. We're going to know, in this case, know your client. We are going to know our donor. We want to ultimately know that the person on the other side of that tzedakah is somebody we're comfortable being in partnership with. And so we've called that out rather explicitly. Receiving gifts where the counterparty is totally unknown to us is relatively, I've been told, rare. But we will be pretty firm about this. We'll be absolutely firm about this, that we need to know the source of the funds that are coming in here. And we need to know if it's coming from a donor advised fund program, who was the human being who pressed the button behind.
Great. And I think two other places where our policy is pretty specific are around clauses in any kind of gift agreements going forward, whereby we reference this policy and how it works at CJP. We, I think we've done it twice. Charlie, you can correct me. I think twice now we have brought two new endowment gifts to CJP, and that gift agreement includes, I think it's section 9, includes a small paragraph that references this policy and, should the donor be found in misconduct, like what would happen and what would happen to the name of their fund, et cetera. And so we've done it exactly twice. And both times it was different. We worked with different kinds of donors who had different legal advice, and it was complicated. But I think that we gave ourselves enough leeway to really make sure we were meeting the donors where they're at. And I would say that the last area that I felt we did a strong job of calling out in the policy, and Judy, I don't know if you want to say anything more about this, is in the space of like honoring people, and we don't give honorary degrees or anything. I'm trying to think of the word degree. I'm sorry. It's only 327. I don't know what's wrong. But the word degree. We don't give honorary degrees, but we do honor lots of donors. In fact, we just came out today with our list of our spring honorees. It's about 15 names. And so I don't know, Judy, if you want to say anything about kind of our commitment to thinking about who and how we select people for public honoring.
So first of all, the list is usually short. The list of potential honorees is long, but the number of slots we have is small. We habitually, because this is our organizational culture, do really thorough due diligence on anything we do. We felt it was important to really enshrine this principle in this policy. So there's actually a specific paragraph devoted to honorees and really articulates our commitment to really thorough and comprehensive, as well as discreet due diligence on our honorees.
Great. Thank you.
The only thing I also wanted to note there was that Judy Kaye is one of those honorees this year, and I wanted to congratulate her for that.
Agreed. All right, well, I am getting the whisper in my ear that I need to wrap up. So I don't know if either of you want to have a last word before I hand it back to Alana. No? Okay. So I'll just say it's been a process, but something that we're really proud of. And we don't have it all right, but we feel like we're on the way to figuring some of these pieces out, and we're going to try and test them as we go. And we're always open to calls and questions from anybody in the field as we learn our way through this. If you have something at your organization that you think we could learn from, we would really, really welcome that as we all continue to try and strengthen our organizations and our communities. And I'll hand it back to Alana. It's been a pleasure seeing all of you today.
Thank you so much to Jennifer Weinstock, Charlie Glassenberg, and Judy Kaye. What an incredible and important conversation about approaches to donor gifts through an SRE lens. We hope that this conversation and all of the conversations today were motivating and inspiring and helped you think differently about ongoing challenges and opportunities and sparked new questions for the future. Today's overall focus was on revitalizing our commitment to safety, respect, and equity in our workplaces. Tomorrow is about revitalizing our commitment to these issues in our communities. We'll learn with leaders from within the Jewish community and beyond. We will start the day at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 noon Eastern, with some brief framing, and then we'll dive directly into our first session with Morningstar Galley, Keshet Star, Zach Heiner, and moderated by our SRE Advisory Board member, Robert Bank. You won't want to miss it. Thank you again for joining us today, and looking forward to seeing you tomorrow.